Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world, happy Thanksgiving. We have much to be thankful for. We have much to reflect upon. And I thought this would be the perfect time to bring back a returning champion. As we reflect on family and all that we've got and all that we've lost, I think of nobody better to help us break down this issue than a returning champion. The great and powerful Anya Kamenetz rejoins us on Independent Americans. Welcome back, Anya.
Thank you so much, my old friend. Good to be here.
I'm so psyched to talk to you because I adore your book. So I'm just going to start with that. We're going to talk about The Stolen Year that I recommend everybody get for Thanksgiving, Christmas, Hanukkah, and everything in between. I really want to dig into what's happening to our kids and what's happening to our culture as we get to the time of year when people spend so much time with family. But before we get to that, last time I spoke to you was May 2020.
Yep.
It's like right when everything was kind of sinking in and going sideways. But I'm excited to have you back. And let's start with the question I ask of everyone. Where are you? And 2 years later, how are you?
Thanks for asking. I am exactly where I was in May of 2020. I'm in my house in Brooklyn. We stayed in our house in Brooklyn. Weathered it out, kept the kids here. And I'm doing pretty well. I mean, I'm looking forward to some rest. The book came out in August, so I've been on the road quite a bit, kind of around the country, which is great. Love having these conversations, but also gets very exhausting, especially when you've been home for 2 years and then all of a sudden you're on a plane every other day.
And is book tour still a thing? Like, how does that work? I see you everywhere, and that's great. But like, I remember I wrote my book like a millennium ago, and like, what is that like now in the post-pandemic or pandemic world, however we're going to categorize it?
I would say nobody knows anything. I do hybrid events. I do books. I've done some bookstore events. I would say in general, the crowds have been a little smaller, not for lack of interest, but just because, people don't show up to things the same way that they did. But it's starting to come back. I mean, I was at a conference in Boston on Sunday, and it was a big conference, like teacher conference. And they come to hear, the latest kind of ideas. And yeah, people showed up. It was a full ballroom. Like that was an experience I hadn't had in a while, like a really full ballroom.
Well, I hope it's because everybody's reading your book, which I think is a must read for all Americans for sure. And not just parents, but for everyone.
Yes.
I think your writing is brilliant and vivid. And it's a book that really powerfully analyzes the policy and the politics while also giving voice to the voiceless. And it's just really smart and important. So let's start with that if we can. As we have this conversation, I'm going to pick up my kids next week for Thanksgiving, tomorrow for Thanksgiving. We just had one person in our family come down with COVID. It's the host of Thanksgiving, so everything's going upside down again.
Oh, boy.
RSV is everywhere, right? We're trying to figure out how to regain what we've lost. But let's start with the big picture. Why did you write this book? You were an expert at NPR, and I've been tracking your education work for so long. But why did you feel like you needed to write this book, Anya?
Yeah. So I think when we talked in May 2020, I already kind of had my mission in hand because I was this front row observer to the national education scene, not just to what was happening with my kids. And I had contacts all over the country. I also was really drawing on my experiences actually with Hurricane Katrina. So, I grew up in New Orleans. I was down there 2 weeks after the storm. I stayed there off and on that year. And that was where my head immediately went because there are so few analogies for times in modern times where rich countries close the doors of their schools. And it happens when there's a major disruption, right? Around the world, it happens when there's a civil war, a crisis, a pandemic, or a natural disaster. And I knew from Katrina that it's a big deal. It's a big deal when schools close down because schools, especially in America, are all we got. They are the sole pillar of the social welfare system in this country. And it's on its own, that's an egregious fact. That's a crisis. But when you close those doors and you close the doors to, the second largest public meal system, the warm, well-lighted place where we have, in a city like New York, 1 in 10 of the children are unstably housed or in shelters. So schools are their place. And so I knew it was going to be a really big deal. And I knew that I was one of the people positioned to tell that deal, to write it down, to bear witness to that, and to help people understand what it was going to mean.
And especially, it's childcare, it's mental health care, it's food, it's all those things, especially for the working class and for the poor in this country, right?
That's right.
You could see some folks had a great pandemic, some folks had a brutal pandemic, right? I think that's the truth, and I know people of all social and political backgrounds, and I saw that to be true, right? The folks who could airlift their kids out and create a little pod in their Hamptons house, and other folks, had nothing. So can you talk about, when you reflect on the big picture, I want to talk about what we got right, what we got wrong, what we should do next time. But in your view, what did we get wrong? Because I think one of the untold stories of the political election that we just had in California, in New York especially, is you saw Democrats get pounded. And I think they got pounded in part because people felt they went overboard on COVID restrictions. I think Hochul and Newsom, especially among moderates and Republicans, were wildly unpopular. And I think it was a lot to do with COVID and shutting down schools and masks. But you have a much more nuanced and thoughtful analysis. What did we get wrong? What did we really get wrong, Anya?
So, I had the luxury of not focusing on the political calculations. And I think there were leaders that did a really good job, like in, to some extent, Connecticut and Rhode Island. They were blue state governors who communicated the urgency of putting our kids first. And so there were obviously people that really capitalized on the social divisions. But to me, the key issue is this. If you have accepted the fact that schools, and to a certain extent, childcare, is an essential service in our society, then your decisions flow from there. And so in our European peer countries that also had a tough time with COVID. Now, let's not move. We could pull back to the counterfactual of we could have not had a COVID disaster that we had, right? So never lose sight of the fact that a lot of lives could have been saved, and that would have been the most, preferable scenario. But assuming COVID came, the CDC messed up the testing and the COVID is spreading around the country. Now, what do? England, Italy, France, Switzerland, the Nordic countries, they pretty quickly made a determination that they were going to reopen their schools and keep them open as much as they could. And they were very clear. The European equivalent of the CDC was clear in a way that our CDC was not, that schools were an essential service for vulnerable children. And so decisions flowed from there. And so you saw in the fall of 2020, there was renewed COVID waves, and they closed down their bars, their restaurants, their nightclubs. Germany closed down its legal brothels and its outdoor holiday markets, kept the schools open. And the message that comes with that is, we understand what this is for vulnerable kids, and we're not going to walk away from our responsibility. Now, there were parents that were scared and kept their kids home if they had the privilege to do so. There were teachers that maybe didn't want that job, to do that. But there was over time a consensus built in those societies that we're putting our kids at the heart of our decisions. And that is where I really point the finger at the US across the board.
Yeah, so the reality was we had bars open and schools closed.
That is what we had. And that is a unique American folly.
Yeah. And there was this argument about business and this argument about freedom. But I think, as we talked about last time you were on the show, kids can't vote. Kids don't have a lobby. Kids, you rarely heard kids. I kept making this point. You rarely heard kids interviewed in the media.
That's right.
Right. You heard from parents. You didn't even hear from teenagers much. And I think now, I have a kid that's now a first grader. We're keeping him back in first grade again, which we think is the right decision. We've got another kid who's in free 3K in New York, which is unique to New York. And I think one of the real unsung heroes of what's happening in this city. But I see the impact on my kids, and I see the impact on other kids. And I think if you really watch, you can see the difference in the way kids interact, the way they feel, the way they learn. But can you've really pulled this apart in some powerful ways. Can you break down, whether it's data driven or statistically, however you look at it, what was the impact now on kids that were learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's, you can segment it out in a bunch of different ways, right? So social interaction, bottom line, that's a key part of kids' healthy development. Once they get past the age of like 18 months or so, peer interaction starts to be important and more important to their learning to interact and to their healthy development and to their moods and their energy and all of that. So kids suffered from that social isolation, even the really privileged ones. And some of them suffered a lot. And that's why we have a youth mental health crisis with increased rates of anxiety, depression, also eating disorders. You're also seeing OCD. And then, so that's on the mental health. And it is a curve that goes along from the younger kids tended to bounce back a little bit quicker. The teenagers may just be feeling it now because there's this sort of languishing long tail effect of realizing what you lost and trying to recover it, right? Then there's sort of developmental learning stuff. So we had a 40% drop in kids that were referred to social special ed services at a young age. So typically there's been this revolution in early intervention, which is from 0 to 3 at the pediatrician's office, in the childcare system, people saying, well, this kid's not quite hitting their milestones. Let's put them into early intervention. And that early intervention, and then the 3K and the 4K, the pre-K, has been so influential in helping kids get that help that they need to eventually get onto track to be with their peers, because developmental disorders follow developmental pathways. So, people say learning loss isn't real because they don't actually forget what they learned. Well, when you talk about a kid with a disability diagnosis, they do forget what they learned. They do regress. They go back. Okay. So kids not getting those referrals in the 0 to, if they were COVID babies, March 20, they're now, 2 years old. We're seeing speech delays. We're seeing heightened rates of need for referrals and services. And then, what this comes into, it slams into a system that is totally overburdened. People have been leaving, teachers are burnt out. And so you have kids with a lot of needs and you have a system with a diminished ability to meet those needs.
And that's kind of where I see us now, right? Like my older boy's been to 4 schools in 4 years. And he's been through, a lot of change. And I see the anxiety on his generation, right? Like when we were their age, we didn't have to worry about our friends around us dying. The closest thing that I had was AIDS, right? And that was not immediate. You didn't see people falling around, unless you were in certain communities, you didn't see people going down around you. You weren't worried about spreading it. So there's this like baked in anxiety that I feel is really unique to this generation. And the mental health crisis, which I think is maybe the most underreported part of all of this. I come from the mental health community working with veterans. And what I know is trauma comes later, right? You experience the trauma, then the grieving comes, then the mourning comes, and trauma could happen 10 years later. I always tell the story about World War II veterans who experienced Pearl Harbor, who had stressful experiences when 9/11 happened. I mean, it was a generation later, but that trauma is baked in, and especially if it's untreated, can come out down the line. So can you talk about the trauma specifically and how traumatic this was for children?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I think, so one of the aspects I talked to a lot of people about was, you think about how kids recover from grief. So we have a generation of COVID orphans. That is almost like the core of the pain that comes for these children. There's 213,000 children in the United States that have lost at least one caregiver to COVID. That's a cohabiting grandparent or a parent. So that in itself, I mean, that is a wave. That's an adverse childhood experience. It's a childhood trauma. And also, just as an analogy for how you think about it, when kids recover from mourning or grieving a loss at a young age, when they get to a new developmental stage, it's almost like they have to grieve it again. So they go through and you see that people kind of re-experience the trauma as they grow. And I think we're, just as you said, like we're going to see kids who are reaching their teenage years, who this was their elementary school experience, and they're going to have a delayed reaction potentially. So I've been saying since the beginning that this is a decade and a half. This is a generational issue. Now, where is the, positive core of that, right? How do we transform this? Because the one thing that I always say is that like kids, the reason we love kids so much is they are potential. They are pure potential. And no kid in the COVID generation is doomed. They are all full of potential. They can all go back and they can have a even better life, because the thing that's so fascinating to me to think about is like when I started talking about parents, writing about parents and kids, we thought our kids were too coddled, right? We thought they were too soft. We thought they lacked grit. We thought they lacked failure. They needed to fail. They need to get out and, they needed to be free range and they need to get out in the woods. And now our kids, no one would say that an American kid lacks grit. Like they have been through a thing, this COVID generation. And so how do we turn that into a reflection of a possible strength?
I want to hold you there because this is this has been a debate in the veterans community, especially since 9/11, about whether or not post-traumatic growth is real.
Yes.
Resiliency, strength, can you be stronger at the broken places? And I want to come to that. But I also want to stay on the education system because what I see is it's cracking. And now you said you're exhausted. I'm exhausted. We're all exhausted. Teachers are really exhausted. They're past the adrenaline. They're past pushing through the fourth quarter. And many of them are retiring. And a lot of them aren't joining. So I feel like we're at this place where our education system is just simply hollowed out in terms of human capital, where we've destroyed the older generation. The middle generation is worn out. The younger generation isn't coming. So can you underscore, and again, I approach this in a framework of COVID as a war, right? We went through this war, that we've declared the war is over. And now we're going through the post-war analysis. We haven't even really gotten to rebuilding yet, but we know the Russian military is completely hollowed out now by this war with Ukraine. How decimated is our education system, Anya?
Yeah, I think that's really astute, that analogy. And I think that the idea of being hollowed out is really interesting. When I looked around at the research of school closures in the past, one thing that often would happen is that there would be a total reimagining of the school system. So we saw this after Katrina, right? There was a shock doctrine, totally from the ground up reimagining of the school system. And, there were big fans of that and big not fans of that, creating an all charter school district. And there were definitely growing pains. There are things that people would not wish on anyone, but there was a huge infusion of people and money into the system. And when you look at where the school system in New Orleans is today, it is better by a lot of measures. I mean, there are things that they've lost. They lost the idea of having a neighborhood school because kids are going all over the city. And that's a huge thing because it's a very neighborhood driven city. But there are, there's been a lot of wisdom and a lot of lessons learned. And I think if you look at how, for example, they reacted to the storm, to COVID, I want to say the storm to COVID, they did better than some places because they've been through that. They've been through that need to pivot and they've been through the need to be resilient. And actually, New Orleans is one of the few places, and they wrote to me and told me this because I talked on an Andy Slavitt's podcast about this, about how nobody had bars closed and schools open. In New Orleans, they did. In the fall of 2020, there was a brief period of time where they got their schools open and they had the bars closed. So sometimes systems learn and remake themselves. Rwanda is another example. So the nation of Rwanda after the genocide completely reinvented their school system from the ground up. I don't see that energy right now. I don't see the reinventors. What I see right now is there have been forces in American society that oppose public schools, that really don't want to see them. They want a privatized system where, religious people can homeschool their kids as they see fit. And basically anybody else, it's whatever they can handle, whatever they can manage to do for themselves. That's the energy that's coming in right now. And you have people leaving the school system. And there's a demographic slump as well. So the public schools are going to lose students no matter what they do. So how do you reconstitute the system? And where is the vision? Where's the juice to really get a new system out there? There's some flares or some bright spots, but it is a very tight slog right now.
We thought a lot about this in my previous job because we saw what happened after Katrina. And there was a potential to reimagine everything, but it also became a deeply entrenched political fight about ideology because, when you wipe out a city, it's a chance to come in and say, let's try charter schools everywhere, or let's double down on public schools and reimagine them. And this is maybe the perfect issue for independent Americans because it feels like you've got extremes on both sides and the hybrid model may be best, but is hard to achieve, or it may be the default of what we get. So it feels like, the old saying at the VA was, if you've seen one VA, you've seen one VA. Is it the case now in America where if you've seen one school, you've seen one school? because it seems like there's such a discrepancy between public and private, and Oklahoma versus California. It feels like everybody's, kind of doing their own thing. And I don't know what that means for the future for our children, and maybe also just for continuity, and community as a nation when our education system is so unfair. I too want to see that national vision after the war. What's our Marshall Plan, right? For education, but it doesn't seem to be out there. So can you talk to all of that? And also, is there anyone in your view that is presenting a vision? Maybe it's on the fringes, maybe it's in academia, maybe it's on the ground. What does a future vision look like?
So I definitely look to the grassroots, and that's the teachers in the classrooms, for the emerging innovations that are truly going to have the most impact on our kids. So a couple of themes that I'm seeing. One is social emotional is not BS. Like schools learned on a very visceral level that the well-being of everybody inside that building is crucial to their mission. And it doesn't matter how many people try to come in and tell you that social emotional is woke or whatever. Like, they know it. They know because they've seen it. And correlated to that, they know that relationships are the core of what they do. And so teachers always kind of do that, but like there's more framework to support that as the center of the whole program, because people saw, like, okay, you go home, well, who can you text, right? Whose number do you have, and who will help you out with this? The parent-teacher relationship got stronger. The expectation for contact between parents and teachers got stronger, between schools and teachers, and then between students and teachers, and students and each other. Because, students really, why do students go to school? They go to school to see their friends. I mean, that's just what it is. So social, emotional, mental health, that's at the core. The other things that I kind of see emerging, the importance of partnerships. So we know schools. So what do you do when you're hollowed out? You call for reinforcements. How can community groups and nonprofits and other public institutions in the community be the school's reinforcements? And how can they work together? I'm seeing so many places where schools are benefiting from working more closely with these community groups, whether that is to bring services that push in or supplement learning, extra tutoring. And then the things that kids miss the most. I mean, what they really missed during the pandemic, they missed the outdoor time, the playtime, the embodied learning, the physical learning. So it's those things that are like more important than ever before. The other area where partnerships are really important is for our high school kids, because they have disconnected from school and they don't see the point of it. And the sad truth is that a lot of high schools, there is not a whole lot of a point to it, right? Just to get there, to get that diploma, to get out. But the partnerships, the co-ops, the internships, and dual enrollment programs where you can be in college and high school at the same time, that's what's going to say, oh, that's why I'm here. I'm here to get the certificate. I'm here because I get to go to the garden, the community garden that I really love. So that's how I think we crawl our way back, is through realizing that schools cannot be doing it alone.
It's such an important perspective, because I mean, I know parents know this. My kid didn't have a social worker at his school for a period last year. He didn't have a mental health care worker at his school a period last year. And that was not uncommon, right? Forget about the art teachers and music teachers and so many other people that went down, right? Or just disappeared and they couldn't backfill them. But the hollowing out of the social components. One of the things that I've seen with my first grader is they have to learn how to handle their bodies, how to not crash into each other. What's an okay push or a hit? How do you play soccer? Like, they don't know, because they haven't been banging into each other for 2.5 years. So they don't know how to bang into each other, right? Those are the pieces that I think are really important. But I want to ask you, I want to move forward on the what's next piece, but I also want to ask you something specific. I think the Secretary of Education has been invisible. I had to Google it to remind myself that it was Miguel Cardona, right? But we had a Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, under Obama, that was playing in the NBA All-Star Celebrity Game, was everywhere, was on late night shows. But Cardona seems, in my view, invisible, and I would fault Biden for that most of all. I don't think Biden and the Secretary of Education are anywhere on the national radar. Can you talk about that and where the leadership should come from them, in my view? But how do you evaluate their performance, frankly?
I think it's a disaster. I think it's a vacuum of ideology in a way, because what happened was that, so we had a bipartisan consensus in education, which was the reformist consensus, which was really exemplified, started with No Child Left Behind, 2001, or George W. Bush. It really was a Republican crossover event where Republicans decided to make themselves known in education, and then Democrats picked up and ran with it. Unfortunately, that consensus ended up centering around testing, high stakes testing, and technology in a way that benefited nobody other than the testing companies and the technology companies. So there's an ed tech boom, which I covered as a reporter. None of that stuff. And then Bill Gates, right? He had one idea after another. He was like the Music Man coming to town with one idea after another to magically fix education. None of that moved the needle. None of it closed in education gaps. None of it inspired teachers coming into the profession. They were demonized. They were put in the center of bullseye. You're going to get penalized for your kids' test scores. And Bill Gates, legitimately with a straight face, his big idea was, we're going to put cameras in the classroom, and then someone's going to be watching your teachers to make sure that they get better at their jobs. Well, that's not how people get better at their jobs. Right. I'll just tell you, not with cameras, not with surveillance.
Right.
So then Betsy DeVos was this wet dream of a total, let's just destroy public education. Her mission since day one has been destroying public education for the sake of the Christians, for the sake of the money people, the libertarians, and the segregationists. It really goes back her, and I go into this in the book, the ideology that she draws on is private religious homeschools. That's what she wants, and for-profit schools. So Cardona is a reaction to a lot of excesses of a lot of years. And he's basically just it's like nobody's in charge. It is like an empty chair right there. And he came into office with the simplest mandate, which was keep the schools open. Which, okay, great. We want the schools open. But what then? Right?
Right.
And so this is what's really, so I'm just amplifying what you're saying, what's really lacking here. But I think that the problem is that there's been 20 years, and the entire time that I've been covering education, there's just been one bad idea after another. And the good ideas have struggled, to really take center stage. And we'll do anything except for listen to teachers and listen to parents.
Yeah, and who are the leaders, right? Who are our wartime leaders, right? And it's at the point where, we're asking our teachers. It's almost I don't know, a demented version of Vietnam, where we're asking them to fight in a war that we're not sure we support, and then when they come home, we shit on them. Teachers have never been under fire or micromanaged or abused. Right? They are now. It's a thankless, profession already, and an underpaid profession already. And you've got the teachers unions by default that are becoming the voices for them. But I really think it's an important thing that I've thought about. Who is the leader for America on education? We don't have one. Right. Yeah. And there aren't even visible voices in this movement. And I feel like it's a time where maybe the young people will rise up and we'll see an immersion of new voices. But I think it's a crisis of leadership. And I don't hear the president talking about it. As a parent, every day he should be talking to us about what's happening to our kids. And we all know our kids have been traumatized. And it's as though they don't recognize it. They want to put it in the rearview mirror. It's not talking about the fact that we all just went through this. Yeah. And I think a failure to focus even on what we're focused on. We did this in the veteran space. Wellness of the veteran was kind of what we were looking at, right? Yeah. Not just how they did on a test or whether they had a disability. You create kind of a matrix or an algorithm that can create a wellness index. And I feel like we don't have that for children. It's testing in some places. It's whether they're in school or dropout rates, but nobody's asking them if they're suicidal. Nobody's asking them if they're hungry. These pieces, I think, are kind of brewing below the surface. And frankly, I'm worried about how it's going to start to emerge in the next couple of years.
I love that you said that. And I love the analogy. I think it's really, really important because, everyone went crazy about the NAEP scores, but that is such the math test, right? It's such a limited vision of who we are, who we want our kids to be, how they want them to see themselves, right? But the other thing that you said that I think is really important is how the youth leadership, right? As much as we're saying that it's garbage and there's nobody leading on education, I definitely look to the March for Our Lives kids, right? The March for Our Lives, the Parkland kids, and obviously they should never have had to do this or create this movement. But one of the first Parkland protesters was just elected to Congress.
Yep.
25 years old, right?
Yep.
So that is the leadership. And in the area that I'm working on climate, it is young people asking their schools to have relevant material on climate because they are saying that they are upset, they're worried, they want to get active on the subject, and they want to learn more. So I talked to a kid in Portland Public Schools passed the best climate policy in the country because the students organized and pushed for it. So I would say elevate the leadership of the kids themselves. Mm-hmm. This is something we rarely have this. I mean, it's on the fringes in education, but it keeps coming back, this progressive idea of like, what if we actually ask the kids what they want, right? Because what worries me about the mental health frame, I mean, I love talking about the mental health frame. I think it's the mental health and well-being of our kids is paramount, absolutely. But our kids are not just, victims. They are people full of potential. And school is not just about them, not being depressed. Like you said, what's their wellness? What's their goal? What's their big why? We have some huge challenges that we want our kids to be prepared to meet. And so, that's really what school is about. And I think we could learn a lot from listening to the kids.
I think that's the core of everything. And I also had this experience of teaching on a college campus where I saw something very unique happening too, which is coaches were filling the void. There are a couple of factors, like professors tended to be older and they had higher health risks. So they were less likely to be in the classroom and they would be on Zoom. Coaches could take them outside. You could be outside, you could talk to them. It wasn't just about school, and they were visible leaders. And I think I'm anxious to explore this over the next couple of years, but I really feel like coaches, and it might be a chess coach or a football coach, but anybody who could be with kids in that environment physically are probably going to be the folks that they look to for mentorship, for leadership, for guidance. And it's one of maybe the upsides is that America's got such a sports-centric education system that the kids who were in sports, I think, will probably do better than the ones who weren't. I mean, you may have data on that, but as we think forward, you've been good at touching on a couple of these pieces. What we get right, Anya, and what does that mean for what's next as RSV and the next pandemic comes? What did we get right and what's coming next?
What did we get right about our COVID response? Or
yes. Is there anything we got right? I mean, I'm sure there are some things. You mentioned the resiliency of our kids, but is there anything we can look to say that was something we did right in America?
That's a really tough one. I mean, I think it's, we lost so many people, Paul. We lost more than 1 million Americans. And we have the highest death rate of any wealthy country in here. So obviously, I mean, I think you can definitely point to the development of the COVID-19 vaccines and the initial rollout. I think you've seen what's been interesting is that, the uptake of that was so linked to ideology, and it still kind of is, and that's terrible. The monetary response to COVID-19 was super interesting. So I document this in my book. So right when schools shut down, there was a unprecedented spike in child hunger. Okay. And that was something that researchers told me they had not seen before in the time that they'd been looking into this issue. But what was so interesting was by the end of the year, and then with Biden coming in with a child tax credit, child poverty actually dropped, and it dropped significantly over the last 2 years. So there was a really interesting whiplash effect. And I saw it in the families that I followed. None of them ended up losing their homes, for example, which was really huge. Even the ones that were out of work, they were able to spend some time at home with their family and actually have income supplementation, which for some of them, that was their only paid leave that they'd ever had as a parent. So the family togetherness is very real. It's not bullshit. And it was a buffering effect. As stressful as it was for parents and for caregivers, there was a buffer in being together. And I know families now, when they look back on that COVID time, there's a little tiny bit of nostalgia for that. As long as you weren't yourself an essential worker on the front lines, you kind of feel like, wow, like I remember when the world shut down and there was nothing for us to do except be together. And I think for families, especially in our like hectic, overscheduled, in our socioeconomic band, like that's a very precious thing that hopefully people remember.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, maybe I'll have to have you back for whether the technology innovations around education were a bright spot or were good or not. I mean, I definitely have a different perspective on content than I used to. I'm maybe a bit more open to some kinds of digital content for my kids than I would have been before the pandemic. But I also think the things like the moratorium on rent and on mortgages, things that we did that seemed to at least keep people in their homes.
Yeah.
But I think it's just, it feels like wreckage, right? It feels like so much wreckage that we're still picking through it and we're trying to figure it out. So as we do that, and it's Thanksgiving, let me ask you to kind of wrap this up. You're also a parent. You've been through this yourself. If somebody, else is a parent, what did you learn? What would you recommend worked for you and your family that might work for other people who have kids who are just looking for leadership and now are looking to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in all of my talks, I talk about post-traumatic growth. And I know you mentioned post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic growth, can be controversial, but part of what they say is to foster it, you have to talk about it. So talking with my kids simply about the fact that they went through something and they might be better because of it, that is really the first step. And I try to bring up the memories of the pandemic and put them into context of like, okay, there's some stuff that we missed out on, but we also had this time together. And you have seen history, like my kids, my 10-year-old, my 6-year-old, they've seen history themselves. And so when we talk about history, we just visited Plymouth. So just on the way to the first Thanksgiving, right? And I was like, this is great. I'm such a nerd. So they loved it. And realizing, okay, wow, like those people, they went through this plague, right? They lost half of the village in the first winter. And it's like, well, you guys know something about that. You know something about history. We're all connected by history, and putting it in that long perspective is something I never fail to find inspiring.
I think that's a great message to end with, because they're not only seeing history, they're writing it now.
Yeah.
And I think they're empowered and rising to a moment. I mean, if there's one thing that my little kids feel is a sense of power. I mean, even understanding that, back in the days, if you don't wear a mask, you're going to kill grandma, right? Like that is a huge amount of responsibility for little ones that I think is going to create some post-traumatic growth. And they've been through something really hard that I don't even pretend to imagine. But I am, as we get to this Thanksgiving, I am extremely grateful for your leadership. I love the book. You're going to stick around for a couple of extra pieces for our Patreon members. Patreon members especially, thank you for making this content possible. Everybody go out and check out The Stolen Year. Get it for the holidays. Get it for everybody you know. And please keep engaging in this conversation. Anya, you are a true hero, and I'm so glad you wrote this book. And I read everything you write, and I'm grateful for everything you do. And I wish you and your family a very happy Thanksgiving.
Same to you, Paul. Thank you so much for having me. This is a really great conversation. Yeah.
Stay vigilant. Thank you.